Parts of the concept are real. Plants respond to electrical signals. Copper is a real micronutrient used in plant metabolism. Electrical stimulation has been shown in laboratories to influence certain biological processes in plants. So the foundation of the idea isn't impossible. The real uncertainty is about how strong the effect actually is in normal farming conditions. Could a copper wire slightly influence plant growth in some situations? Possibly. Could it triple your harvest every time? That's where the claim becomes much harder to support. Another important point is that agriculture is extremely complex. Soil microbes, sunlight, temperature, water, nutrients, and genetics all interact in ways that are difficult to isolate. A technique that works in one garden might do nothing in another, and yet the story refuses to disappear. Every year, more gardeners experiment with copper wires, antennas, and other electroculture setups. Some report no difference at all. Others claim their plants grow faster or produce larger harvests. Most of these experiments happen quietly in backyards and small farms, far away from formal research laboratories, which leaves the topic stuck in an unusual place. Too strange for mainstream agriculture to take seriously, but too persistent to completely ignore. History has shown that some farming ideas once considered strange later turned out to have real value, and others truly were just myths. At the moment, electroculture sits right in the middle of that uncertainty. So the real answer isn't a dramatic yes or a clear no. It's a question that is still open. Maybe the copper wire does nothing. Maybe the effect is small and easily exaggerated. Or maybe there is still something happening in the interaction between plants, soil, and atmospheric electricity that science hasn't fully explored yet. And until someone runs large, controlled experiments that settle the debate once and for all, the question will keep coming back, not because it sounds convincing, but because it sounds just possible enough that people keep testing it. But skepticism does not mean the idea is impossible. A few modern studies have explored how electrical fields interact with plant biology. Some research suggests that weak electrical stimulation may influence enzyme activity, cell membrane behavior, and the way roots absorb minerals from the soil. Studies related to electrostimulation in plants have shown that electrical signals can trigger biochemical reactions inside plant tissues. At the same time, copper itself plays a real biological role. Plants use copper in extremely small amounts for important metabolic processes. It helps activate enzymes that support photosynthesis and protect plants from oxidative stress. But copper can also become toxic if too much accumulates. So even if copper wires do influence plant behavior, the effect would likely depend on very specific conditions: soil chemistry, moisture levels, plant species, and how the metal interacts with the environment. This is why the scientific debate continues. Supporters point to historical experiments and modern observations that suggest something interesting may be happening. Critics argue that until large, controlled studies prove consistent results, the claim of tripled harvests remains highly doubtful. So the scientific community remains divided not in a dramatic conspiracy, but in a familiar situation. Intriguing observations, incomplete evidence, and a phenomenon that might be real, exaggerated, or simply misunderstood. So after all this, where does the truth actually land? Right now, there is no strong scientific proof that a single copper wire can reliably triple your harvest. Most agricultural scientists would agree on that. Large-scale studies that clearly confirm those dramatic results simply don't exist. And without consistent, repeatable experiments, science usually refuses to make big claims. But that doesn't mean the entire idea is fake either. This is exactly why the technique became so controversial. It's simple enough for anyone to test, but inconsistent enough to create endless debate. Still, the idea never completely disappeared. Over the past few years, electroculture has started gaining attention again online, especially among organic gardeners and people interested in low-cost farming methods. Videos showing large harvests have spread quickly across social media. Some of them have millions of views, and that renewed attention has brought the debate back to life. This is where the story becomes complicated, because when you start looking for scientific studies about electroculture, the results are mixed. Some experiments suggest that electrical stimulation can influence plant growth. Others show little to no effect. And many researchers argue that the evidence is still too weak to support the dramatic claims often seen online. But the idea itself is not completely outside science. Scientists have been studying how electricity affects plants for more than a century. Some laboratory experiments have shown that small electrical fields can influence root growth, seed germination, and nutrient absorption. Plants are sensitive to electrical signals. The challenge is proving that simple copper setups in a garden can reliably produce those effects. Many modern agricultural researchers point out a major problem. Most electroculture experiments are not controlled very well. Soil conditions change from place to place. Weather varies. Plant genetics differ. Even small environmental changes can affect yields. Because of that, it becomes difficult to prove that copper or atmospheric electricity is the real cause of any improvement. This is one reason many scientists remain skeptical. Another issue involves expectations. When someone tries a new gardening technique, they often pay more attention to those plants. They water them carefully. They monitor them more closely. Sometimes the extra care alone can improve results. This effect is well known in science and is often called the observer effect. Even with all the theories, most gardeners care about one thing. How is this actually used? The simplest version of the technique is surprisingly basic. A thin piece of copper wire is inserted through the lower part of a plant's stem, usually a few centimeters above the soil. The wire passes straight through and stays there as the plant grows. Some growers prefer a different method. Instead of piercing the stem, they place a copper rod or copper wire in the soil next to the plant, leaving part of it exposed to the air. Both methods follow the same idea. Copper acts as a conductor between the air and the ground. Supporters believe this allows tiny electrical charges from the atmosphere to travel through the metal and into the soil around the roots. The materials are simple: a thin copper wire, a small copper rod, or even recycled copper from old cables. That simplicity is one reason the method keeps spreading online. Anyone can try it in a garden without expensive equipment. But there are some important details. First, the wire must be very thin. Thick copper can damage the stem too much, which stresses the plant instead of helping it. Second, the wire is usually placed in the lower part of the stem, where the plant is stronger and better able to heal around the small puncture. Third, timing matters. Most people who experiment with this method do it when the plant is still young, but already established. Tomatoes are one of the most common plants used in these tests. Many gardeners claim that tomato plants treated with copper wires produce thicker stems and larger fruit clusters. Some people try it with peppers, cucumbers, and even fruit trees, but not everyone sees results. Some gardeners report bigger harvests. Others say nothing changed at all. And sometimes plants actually grow worse if the stem is damaged too much. But here's where things become interesting. Copper is also one of the best natural conductors of electricity. When copper is placed in soil, it can interact with moisture, minerals, and the natural electrical differences that exist between the air and the ground. This is the basic idea behind electroculture. The atmosphere constantly carries small electrical charges. At the same time, the soil holds its own electrical potential. When a conductor like copper connects these two environments, it can allow tiny electrical flows to move through the system. These flows are extremely small. We're not talking about visible sparks or anything dramatic, but even weak electrical signals can influence biological systems. Some researchers believe that these microcurrents may stimulate root activity, increase nutrient absorption, or trigger growth responses in plants. Others suggest that electrical stimulation may influence microorganisms in the soil, which indirectly affects plant health. Another possibility involves plant stress responses. When a plant experiences mild stress, it sometimes reacts by strengthening its growth systems. The plant produces more defensive compounds, increases metabolic activity, and adapts to the environment. This is known as a hormetic response, a small challenge that triggers stronger growth. So in theory, a copper wire interacting with natural electrical fields could create subtle stimulation around the plant. Not enough to harm it, but possibly enough to change how the plant behaves. That doesn't mean the results would always be dramatic. It also doesn't guarantee tripled harvests. But from a purely biological perspective, the idea is not impossible. Plants respond to minerals. Plants respond to electricity. And copper happens to interact with both. Electroculture devices, on the other hand, were simple. Once installed, they required almost no ongoing cost. From a commercial perspective, that made them difficult to scale as a global industry. By the mid-1900s, agricultural science had largely moved in another direction. Research funding focused heavily on fertilizers, pesticides, and plant genetics. Electroculture slowly faded out of the conversation, not necessarily because it was proven impossible, but because it was inconsistent, difficult to standardize, and overshadowed by technologies that fit better into industrial farming. And once something is labeled a myth, very few scientists want to risk their reputation revisiting it. So the question remained unanswered for decades. Was the idea truly useless? Or was it simply abandoned before anyone fully understood how it worked? Because to answer that, we need to look at something even more basic: how plants actually respond to copper and electricity. Plants are not just passive organisms sitting in the soil. Inside every plant, there is constant electrical activity. Tiny electrical signals move through the tissues, helping control processes like nutrient transport, growth direction, and stress responses. In fact, plants react to electrical stimulation much more than most people realize. When roots absorb nutrients from the soil, charged particles move through plant cells. Potassium, calcium, magnesium, and other minerals all carry electrical charges. These ions move through microscopic channels, creating small electrical currents inside the plant. So electricity is already part of plant biology. Now add copper to the picture. Copper is not a random metal. It is actually an essential micronutrient for plants. In very small amounts, plants use copper to activate important enzymes. These enzymes help with photosynthesis, respiration, and the plant's natural defense systems. Without copper, plants struggle to grow properly. If this idea existed for decades, the obvious question is simple: why did it disappear? Why did something that once attracted patents, experiments, and government attention end up being labeled as nonsense? To understand that, we need to go back to the early 1900s. During that time, several inventors started experimenting with something called electroculture. The idea was based on a simple observation: the atmosphere is full of electrical energy. Lightning is the most obvious example, but even on calm days, the air carries small electrical charges. Some researchers believed plants could react to that energy. One of the most famous experiments came from a French inventor named Justin Christofleau. He developed devices made with copper wires designed to capture atmospheric electricity and direct it into the soil around crops. Farmers who tested the system reported stronger plants, larger vegetables, and higher yields. Photos of massive cabbages, tomatoes, and potatoes began circulating in farming publications. Some reports claimed harvests increased by 20%, 30%, and occasionally even more. Naturally, this attracted attention. Agricultural groups wanted to verify the results. Committees were formed to investigate. Demonstrations were organized in fields where the devices were installed, but the results were inconsistent. Some farms reported clear improvements, others saw little difference, and that inconsistency quickly became a problem. Around the same time, another revolution was happening in agriculture. Synthetic fertilizers were becoming widely available thanks to the Haber-Bosch process. This technology allowed factories to produce massive amounts of nitrogen fertilizer. Suddenly, farmers had a predictable way to increase yields by simply adding chemicals to the soil. Unlike electroculture, fertilizers produced results that were easier to measure and easier to sell. Companies could manufacture them, distribute them, and sell them every season. For nearly 100 years, this idea has been treated like nonsense and pushed out of mainstream agriculture. The claim is simple: place a piece of copper near a plant, or run a thin copper wire through the stem, and yields can dramatically increase. In some reports, harvests didn't just improve, they multiplied. No chemical fertilizers, no expensive equipment, no complex system, just copper, soil, and the natural electricity already present in the air. Back in the 1920s, this wasn't just a rumor. A French inventor filed an official patent for a device designed to capture atmospheric electricity and direct it into the soil. Government committees reviewed field results. Photographs of unusually large crops were published in agricultural magazines. Observers were sent to verify what was happening in those fields. Then, almost overnight, the conversation stopped. The technology wasn't improved. It wasn't industrialized. It wasn't integrated into mainstream farming. It was dismissed, Around the same time, synthetic fertilizers began to dominate global agriculture. Factories started producing ammonia on a massive scale. Farmers were told that bigger harvests required chemical input, and every season meant another purchase. A method that required buying nothing after installation didn't fit that model. Today, if you bring up electroculture or copper-based crop stimulation, the reaction is immediate. Experts roll their eyes. Articles label it pseudoscience. The topic rarely makes it into serious agricultural debate, but here's the uncomfortable part. Official patents exist. Government investigations existed. Large-scale modern experiments with atmospheric electricity have shown measurable increases in yield. So the real question isn't whether the story sounds strange. The real question is why something once investigated at official levels ended up buried under the word myth. Was it proven false? Or was it simply pushed aside?